For 1,000 years, the Roman Empire was synonymous with power. Its legions had forged an empire that spanned 3 continents, unified by law, language, and the promise of civilization. But by the 5th century AD, that colossal structure was a hollow shell. The history books tell us the Western Roman Empire vanished on a cold day in 476 AD. The simple answer is barbarians. But that's a surface scratch. The true story of Rome's collapse is a damning case study in failed strategy, economic rot, and political self-sabotage. To understand the collapse, we must go back to the 3rd century when the empire realized a terrifying truth: it was too big to govern. The border was too vast to patrol, communication was too slow, and civil wars had become the norm. The entire system suffered a near-death experience known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In an act of strategic desperation, Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into 4 regions, and later Emperor Constantine made the split permanent, moving the capital not just to the east but to a strategically brilliant, defensible city, Constantinople. This strategic pivot, shifting the empire's political and financial heart to the Bosphorus, in what is now modern-day Turkey, was the most important strategic decision of the late empire. It saved the East, but it was a mortal wound for the West. It stripped Rome of its most valuable resource, wealth. The Roman Empire required a colossal military. The army was its blood and bone, but a large professional army requires a vast, reliable stream of gold and silver. This is where Rome's core weakness became fatal. The strategy of expansion had failed. Rome's economy was fueled by conquest, loot, slaves, and neo-gold mines. When expansion stopped around 117 AD, the revenue stream dried up. But the military spending, the necessary cost of defense, kept rising. The only short-term solution was disastrous currency debasement. To pay the legions and fund the bloated bureaucracy, emperors began minting new coins with less and less precious metal. A silver coin from the 1st century was nearly pure. By the 3rd century, the silver content was almost non-existent. The state was lying about the value of its money. The result was predictable: rampant, terrifying inflation, prices skyrocketed, merchants and soldiers began demanding payment in actual goods, not worthless state-minted coin. The entire urban, tax-based economy that had funded the empire was crumbling, replaced by an unreliable, localized barter system. As the state's money failed, the wealthy elite withdrew from the centralized system. This is the phenomena of the villa system. Rich landowners effectively sealed themselves off on massive self-sufficient estates. They did not need the cities, and crucially, they did not pay their full share of taxes to the central government. In the West, the Senate and the aristocracy, still obsessed with the status games in Rome, engaged in colossal tax evasion. The strategic effect was devastating. The central government was starving of revenue while the rich were thriving outside of its control. The West had the land, but the East, centered in Constantinople, controlled the major trade routes and had a much more robust central tax system. The strategic divide became a financial divide. When the money vanishes, everything follows, but most critically, the army. The army was the most resource-intensive part of the empire. In its prime, the army was a disciplined, Roman-born fighting machine, but decades of plague, civil war, and economic hardship had drastically shrunk the Roman population, especially the Italian core. The pool of loyal, disciplined recruits dried up. Facing an existential manpower crisis, and the strategic solution was to outsource, Rome became relying on non-Romans, the very people they called barbarians, to fight their wars. They were brought in an Foederati, allied troops settled within Roman borders, paid to defend the frontier. This was the strategic gamble of the late empire, and it contained a lethal flaw. The Foederati's loyalty was not to the emperor in Ravenna, but to their own tribal chiefs and their immediate commander, often a fellow barbarian. The greatest strategic blunder occurred in 376 AD. A massive Gothic people, the Visigoths, sought refuge from the terrifying Huns. The Romans, desperate for manpower, adopted a ruinous strategy. They let hundreds of thousands in, but immediately subjected them to horrific mistreatment, starvation, and corruption. Inevitably, Visigoths revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, the Gothic cavalry shattered a Roman field army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. This single event broke the strategic mystique of the Roman legion. It showed the barbarians that Rome was not invincible, and it proved that their own forces could defeat the empire on its own terms. From that point on, Roman foreign policy in the West shifted from domination to appeasement. The emperors had to grant land, titles, and subsidies to these armed groups inside their own borders. The men who truly commanded the Western armies, the powerful Magristi militum, which is called masters of the soldiers, were often of Gothic or Vandal descent. The West was defended by the generals of foreign origin, who were now essentially carving out private kingdoms. When the Vandals seized the breadbasket province of North Africa in 429 AD, it was the final, irreversible strategic blow. North Africa fed Rome and provided the empire with its last major reliable source of tax revenue. Once that was lost, the Western state was financially bankrupt and strategically crippled. The core issues were not outside pressure, but the internal strategy for dealing with it: currency collapse, aristocratic tax evasion, and outsourcing the army's loyalty. These three internal failures turned external pressure into existential crisis. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was on life support. The final blows were a result of compounded strategic errors, not a single invasion. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric did the unthinkable. They sacked the city of Rome. It had been 800 years since a foreign army had breached its walls. Strategically, this event did not end the empire. The emperor lived in Ravenna, but psychologically, emotionally, it was the ultimate breakdown of Roman identity. The city was no longer the eternal fortress. Over the next few decades, the central authority simply faded away. Imperial decrees stopped reaching the provinces, taxes went uncollected, and the coinage vanished. Life for the average Roman did not end, but the state they knew was replaced by local military rulers. In the provinces, Britain, Gaul, Spain, local elites had to choose a new, more reliable protector. The Germanic chieftains, these men who started as Roman generals, simply stopped taking orders and turned their temporary settlements into permanent kingdoms. Here is the crucial contrast. While the West was hollowed out by economic rot, the Eastern Roman Empire, our focus on the Bosphorus in Anatolia, was strategically positioned to survive. Its capital, Constantinople, was defended by impenetrable walls. It controlled the major trade routes, ensuring a reliable flow of wealth. Crucially, its emperors were always in command of their own army. In the West, the final event in 476 AD was not a great battle, but a minor internal coup. The general Odoacer, one of those barbarian masters of the soldiers, simply deposed the last emperor, Romulus Angustulus, and sent the imperial regalia back to the emperor in Constantinople. There was no great crash, no world-ending war. The position of West Emperor had become strategically and financially worthless. The deposition was simply the confirmation that the Western Roman state, the central bureaucracy, unified law, the vast tax collecting machine, was no longer a going concern. It didn't fall, it dissolved. This brings us back to where I was in Turkey at the site of ancient Byzantium. The story of Rome doesn't end in the West, it simply moved its strategic headquarters. While the most collapsed into fragmented kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as Byzantium, endured for another 1,000 years. It preserved Roman law, Roman administration, and the Roman ambition for empire, all from its impregnable capital. The real lesson of the Roman collapse is that no great war is immune to internal strategic failure. It was not a lack of strength that doomed Rome, but the failure of its leaders to adapt to a changing economic landscape and the tragic strategic error of outsourcing the loyalty of the very army meant to protect it. If you want to dive deeper into the tactics and economics of the late Roman army, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Thank you very much.